Hi, the Reverend Naomi King here, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the verse from Matthew, chapter 5, verse 44, where Jesus is reported to have said, "But I say, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you." One of those stretched spiritual practices. How do we really love our enemies? Some people feel that loving one's enemies is to pray for their conversion to your own point of view. I don't find that to be so. I do hope for people to have more compassion and more love, and also to experience more joy in their lives. That's some of my prayer. More gratitude, more wonder, more ease, less suffering. And that's all in part because I believe that when we are suffering and when we are experiencing hardship or cruelty or a lack of joy, that it's a lot easier to be harmful to others, to persecute somebody else. So that change of heart is part of what I've found important for my own self. Because I've been pretty hard-hearted at sometimes in my life, and sometimes I can drop back into that, particularly when I feel threatened, particularly when I'm exhausted and angry by cruelty happening in the world, particularly when others are really sharp and mean to me. That's a natural response. My natural response is to fight often, not to flee, not to tremble in fear, and not to faint or to fawn. Which response you typically do has something to do with your body chemistry and also your culture and how you move through the world. Fawning is a really important response when you belong to an oppressed culture or group and other people have power around you, and they will use it violently. And so fawning is a necessary response in order to survive. Fleeing is only available to us sometimes, and some of us, of course, get targeted for fleeing, must be guilty because we are fleeing, giving it, responding to that fear, and instead of fighting. Now, for those of us who would be in that category where we'd be guilty for fleeing, we're also going to be guilty for fighting. So really the only option there is the fawning part. And then there's fainting, which is that overload of the system. And again, culturally, that's only available to a certain subsection of a group, particularly in white supremacist culture. That tends to be reserved for white women. And everybody else who does that is going to be guilty for fainting. So, fight, flight, freeze, fear, tremble, or fawn. Whatever our response is, it's so much easier to view somebody as an enemy if our bodies are eliciting those responses around them. And that might be from very good reasons. Now, of course, trauma is what happens when that happens in our bodies, where we have those responses of fight, flight, fear, freeze, or fawn, and there isn't an immediate threat. That's because we've become habituated to the only way to protect ourselves. Everything that comes at us that startles us is going to be needing one of these responses. That's trauma. And so there's trauma work to be done, trauma recovery work. It's hard to do trauma recovery work, though, when we're not in a position to be free from constantly being more traumatized. So that's some of the background why this idea that we have to love those who are our enemies and pray for those who persecute us is such a radical and challenging spiritual practice. This is not an easy lift. This is definitely heavy lifting. And so we might start with somebody that isn't really an enemy, just somebody who's a little bit on the challenging side, and that could even be ourselves, right? Where we focus on points of connection with that person, rehumanize them, because when people have become enemies, they're no longer people fully. They become less than three-dimensional. They're two-dimensional, and we have a two-dimensional response to that. The other piece of that is to recognize that they may not be in a position, just because we can love on our enemies doesn't mean those who are persecuting or ascribing themselves as enemies to us are ready to love on us. And so there is some negotiation around, what's an appropriate distance, how to not get into an abusive environment. If you are in an abusive environment, I strongly encourage, if you have any way to leave that environment, to please do, to take care of yourself, because that first commandment on loving ourselves is so important. And if you're not here to bring your gifts to the world, then we're going to all miss out on that. So the first part is that self-preservation. That said, now we're in a fairly safe space. Let's assume that that's true. It may not be an entirely safe space. That might not be your reality of what you can live with. Where you live might not be entirely safe. That's true for lots and lots of people. And this idea that there's some sort of like magical safety zone is and of itself, and that you merit that and you can create it and everybody has access to that, is and of itself part of this dominant culture in the United States that creates victims out of people and blames them for being victims themselves. Like they're responsible for the fact that they were not safe. Some safety is within our control, some safety is not. We do the parts that we can do, and then we have to let go of the rest. Recognizing that we need bravery, courage to stay with the stuff that's not. So how do we love our enemies? Back to that. Connection. Have you ever been so angry or hurtful to somebody? Have you ever been somebody else's enemy and been mystified why you were, or knew why you were and want to deny that and like push that uncomfortableness a bit away? Well, then you have that ground for empathy with the person that's persecuting you. The other piece of that is opening to the heart of compassion. As you know, if you followed me at all, I believe that one of the great characteristics that I describe of as the holy is compassion. And it's something we can all tap into so that we can be with one another and recognize the goodness that's possible in each of us, the potential seed of goodness, the seeds of joy, the seeds of hope, the seeds of love that are inside, even if they've never been given the conditions to grow, or they've really suppressed or weeded out on a regular basis. So I come back to compassion. And when I pray for those who persecute me, I'm praying for them to be free from internal and external harm, for them to have less suffering, for them to have more joy and ease, for us to be able to make connections for peace and for larger well-being. Those are sometimes challenging prayers to myself, but I don't pray because I expect somebody else to go take care of it, or some other being to take care of it. Part of how I understand God works in the world is through us. And so that's also, I'm praying for myself to direct myself in that way. I will love this person. I want them to be well. I want them to have safety. I want them to know well-being. I want them to have joy. And not that false joy of power over somebody else, but like real joy. Joy because the sun has risen. Joy, because it's the dark of the moon and there's so many blessings in darkness. Joy, because we're shoulder to shoulder, just leaning there, having that nice sense of connection, breathing and enjoying that day. That's joy. I want people to have that. I wish that for you, and you're not my enemy. And I wish that for all of us. So that we stop seeing and treating one another as enemies and stop persecuting one another. This is part of loving each other as we love ourselves. May we go forth, do the heavy lifting for the practice, and keep trying to bring healing and love into this world. Thanks for joining me today.